Most players spend their entire careers fighting for a bigger contract. More money, more security, more respect. So when news broke that WNBA players were being told not to sign contracts, it stopped a lot of people cold. Not by the league, not by the owners, but by one of the most powerful players in the sport, Breanna Stewart, a superstar, a union vice president, and now a co-owner of a league that directly competes with the WNBA. And suddenly, what looked like a routine free agency process turned into something far more dangerous. A power struggle where millions of dollars, player unity, and the future of the league all collided at once. Because this wasn't just about contracts anymore. It was about who actually controls the WNBA now. And the league's response? It wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was calculated. And it caught everyone off guard. When the WNBA sent out qualifying offers, most people barely noticed. On paper, it looked like standard procedure. Old CBA numbers. Modest salaries. Nothing flashy. But that's exactly why it worked. Because these offers were never meant to be signed. They were meant to be seen. Suddenly, every free agent in the league had a real contract sitting in their inbox. Not a promise. Not a talking point. A number. A name. A deadline. And right next to it, the rumored numbers from the new collective bargaining agreement. That's when the gap became impossible to ignore. A max salary that used to cap around $250,000, now projected to climb toward over $1 million. Mid-tier players who had been scraping by on six figures, now staring at contracts worth 8 or 9 times more than what they'd ever made before. This wasn't incremental change. This was life-altering money. The kind that decides whether you rent forever or finally own something. Whether you fly overseas every off-season or actually let your body recover. Whether you're one injury away from financial panic or finally stable. And yet, almost immediately, the players' union stepped in with a clear message. Don't sign anything. Wait. Hold the line. At first, that sounded like solidarity. But then people started asking the obvious question. If the money on the table is this big, why stop players from even considering it? And that's where this story took a turn that made everyone uncomfortable. Because the loudest voice urging patience wasn't just a union leader. It was someone with something else to gain. And that's where the conflict nobody wanted to talk about began to surface. But Breanna Stewart's role in all of this makes the situation far more complicated than it looks. Breanna Stewart isn't just another voice in this dispute. She sits at the intersection of every major power structure in women's basketball right now. On one side, she's a cornerstone WNBA superstar, a face of the league, a player whose voice carries weight in every locker room. On another side, she's a vice president of the WNBA Players Association, tasked with protecting the collective interests of players across the league, from household names to end-of-the-bench veterans. And then there's the third role, the one that changed everything. Breanna Stewart is also a co-owner of Unrivaled, a new women's basketball league designed to operate outside the WNBA ecosystem. A league that offers players alternative income streams, different structures, and most importantly, leverage. That's when critics stopped calling this a labor dispute and started calling it something else entirely. A conflict of interest. Because when Stewart encourages players not to sign WNBA contracts, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It happens in a landscape where delaying the WNBA season, destabilizing free agency, or dragging negotiations out longer could indirectly benefit a competing league trying to gain relevance and talent. That doesn't mean intent. But perception matters. And perception is exactly what started to crack. The uncomfortable truth is this. Breanna Stewart can afford to wait. She has endorsement deals. She has ownership equity. She has financial insulation that most WNBA players will never touch. But the sixth player on a roster in Dallas or Atlanta, she doesn't have that luxury. For her, a delayed season isn't a strategy. It's rent. It's medical bills. It's another year of flying overseas just to stay afloat. And this is where the unity message begins to fracture. Because solidarity sounds powerful, until the sacrifices aren't evenly distributed. What's being framed as a collective stand starts to feel like a gamble taken by people who won't suffer the consequences. And that's why this moment feels different than past labor fights. In previous disputes, players were largely aligned. The money wasn't there yet. The injustice was obvious. The gap between ownership wealth and player pay was impossible to defend. But now the league is offering something it never has before. Real money, real growth, real transformation. Which leads to the question no one wanted to ask out loud. If this isn't about money anymore, then what is it about? Because the league's next move made one thing very clear. They weren't going to fight this emotionally. They were going to fight it psychologically. And it worked. Because once public opinion shifted, there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. At the beginning, the narrative was airtight. Women athletes deserve fair pay. The league is finally gaining momentum. It's time to share the success. That message resonated. Even people who didn't watch the WNBA nodded along. For about 10 days. Then the tone changed. Inflatable rats appeared at protests. Digital billboards circled major cities. Social media posts escalated from negotiation language to personal grievance. And suddenly, something fell off. Casual fans weren't seeing a labor dispute anymore. They were seeing hostility. They started asking basic questions, the kind that derail movements fast. Why does this feel personal? Why does it feel like revenge instead of negotiation? And most importantly, why are players acting like the league has been hiding profits when it's never made any? That's when an inconvenient fact resurfaced. The WNBA has never turned a profit. Not once. Not in nearly 3 decades. That's not owner spin. That's documented reality. The NBA has subsidized the league every single year since its creation. Loss after loss, written off in the name of growth, brand expansion, and long-term vision. And yet, that reality barely appeared in union messaging. Instead, the tone suggested theft, exploitation, bad faith. For hardcore supporters, that framing still worked. But for casual fans, the ones the league desperately needs right now, it didn't. Because from the outside, it started to look like players were rejecting massive raises while demanding moral victories that couldn't be quantified or negotiated. And when public support wavers, leverage disappears fast. But the real danger wasn't public opinion. It was what was happening quietly inside locker rooms. Because once players started doing the math for themselves, unity became a lot harder to maintain. And that's where the league's most dangerous advantage came into play. From the outside, telling players to hold the line sounds noble, unified, principled, powerful. But inside the WNBA, waiting doesn't cost everyone the same. For a small group of stars, delay is inconvenient. For everyone else, it's dangerous. The public conversation keeps circling the same names: Breanna Stewart, Aya Wilson, Sabrina Ionescu, Caitlin Clark. Players with visibility, endorsements, long-term security. But that's not who this dispute affects the most. The real stakes belong to the middle of the roster, the 6th through 11th players, the ones without shoe deals, national ads, or side businesses. Right now, many of them are living in small apartments, budgeting every month carefully, knowing their careers could end with one awkward landing or one bad knee. For those players, the new CBA isn't about fairness in theory. It's about survival in reality. Under the proposed deal, some of them would earn more in one season than they've made in several combined. Enough to buy a home. Enough to stop chasing overseas contracts every winter. Enough to finally rest instead of risking their bodies year-round. That's why the qualifying offers hit differently. They force players to confront a personal question instead of a collective one. Do I wait for something better that may never come? Or do I take a deal that changes my life right now? That's a brutal choice, especially when the people urging patience aren't facing the same risks. And this is where unity starts to feel less like strength and more like pressure. Because solidarity only works when sacrifices are shared equally. And they aren't. Some players can miss a year and still be fine. Others can't afford to miss a single paycheck. That imbalance doesn't make anyone evil. But it makes this strategy fragile. And the league knows it. Which is why the conversation is quietly shifting away from ideology and towards something far more uncomfortable: individual self-interest. Because once players start thinking about their own futures instead of abstract principles, everything changes. And that leads to a reality the union doesn't want to test. The idea that the league might not need everyone to move forward. Here's the truth that veteran players don't want to hear. The WNBA's recent surge didn't happen because of long-tenured stars. It happened because of rookies. Caitlin Clark didn't just boost ratings, she rewired them. Angel Reese brought in a new audience. Paige Buchers became a must-watch story before even stepping onto a pro court. The matchups casual fans care about aren't built around max contracts. They're built around names they already recognize. And almost all of those names are on rookie deals. That matters more than people want to admit, because it means the league's leverage isn't as weak as it once was. If veteran players refuse to sign, the season doesn't automatically collapse. The games people tune in for can still happen. Clark versus Buchers. Clark versus Reese. Rookies versus rookies. Throw in overseas players. Fringe talent hungry for opportunity. Athletes who would sign tomorrow without hesitation. From a cold business perspective, the product still exists. And that's the part that makes this situation so dangerous. Because if the league believes it can survive, even temporarily, without its veteran core, then the union's greatest weapon starts to look dull. This isn't a threat. It's a calculation. And the calculation says the power has shifted. For years, veteran players were the league. Now they're part of it, but not the engine driving growth. And when growth comes from youth, the future becomes harder to hold hostage. Which brings us to the option no one wants to admit is real. The nuclear option. Replacement players. The phrase alone makes people uncomfortable. It sounds extreme, disrespectful, unthinkable, until it isn't. The truth is, professional sports has gone down this road before. And once the idea enters the conversation, it never fully leaves. If negotiations stall long enough, the league has a choice. Wait indefinitely, or move forward without unanimity. And that's when everything becomes personal. Because the first player to sign isn't betraying a movement. She's protecting herself. She's choosing financial stability over abstract unity. Certainty over promises. Security over symbolism. And once that happens, once one player breaks rank, the entire strategy collapses. Not because players are weak, but because human nature is predictable. No one wants to be the last person holding the line while everyone else secures their future. The league understands that. They're betting that pressure works better than threats. That money speaks louder than messaging. That reality eventually overrides ideology. And the longer this drags out, the more likely that bet becomes. Because the union doesn't just need unity. It needs perfect unity. And history shows that perfect unity never lasts when millions of dollars are involved. And once that first signature hits paper, there's no resetting the clock. Labor disputes don't usually collapse because of contracts. They collapse because the story stops making sense. For a brief moment, the WNBA players had something rare, near-universal sympathy. Even people who barely followed women's basketball understood the headline. The league was finally growing, and the players wanted their share. That argument was clean, moral, easy to defend. But then the message changed. Negotiation language gave way to symbolism. Press releases turned into spectacle. And the tone shifted from fair pay to we were wronged. That's when casual fans started backing away. Not loudly, not angrily, but quietly. And in media, silence is far more dangerous than criticism. Because once people stop engaging emotionally, leverage disappears. The inflatable rats didn't land the way they were supposed to. The protest trucks didn't feel righteous, they felt performative. And the social media campaigns started sounding less like labor advocacy and more like resentment. Meanwhile, one inconvenient fact kept resurfacing in comment sections and sports radio segments. The WNBA has never been profitable. Not once. For years, that reality was brushed aside as irrelevant or unfair. But during a negotiation like this, it suddenly mattered again. Because from the outside, it looked like players were rejecting a historic offer while refusing to acknowledge the financial reality of the league they were negotiating with. That disconnect didn't just confuse fans, it alienated them. And once casual viewers disengage, networks notice. Sponsors notice. Owners notice. Which raises a question no one in the union wants to answer publicly. If public support erodes, who is this fight actually for? Here's where the silence gets loud. Because despite how obvious the conflict looks on paper, most major outlets have carefully avoided one uncomfortable topic. Breanna Stewart's dual role. A union vice president telling players not to sign contracts, while owning a stake in a league that benefits from instability in the WNBA. That should be a headline. Instead, it's treated like a footnote or ignored entirely. Not because journalists don't see it, but because touching it invites backlash. So the conversation stays surface level. Owners versus players. Money versus respect. But the deeper tension goes unexamined. What happens when leadership incentives don't align with the people they represent? Because even if Stewart's intentions are pure, the optics are brutal. And optics matter in negotiations just as much as numbers. When mid-tier players look at this situation, they don't see strategy. They see risk. They see leaders who can afford patience asking others to make sacrifices they themselves won't feel. And that's when trust starts to erode, quietly, privately, player by player. Not enough to make headlines, but enough to change outcomes. What makes this standoff so dangerous isn't the disagreement itself. It's the timing. The WNBA has been through labor tension before. Players have fought owners before. Complaints about pay, resources, respect. None of that is new. What is new is this moment. Because for the first time in the league's history, the fight isn't happening during stagnation. It's happening during momentum. Ratings are up. Attendance is up. Media coverage is exploding. The league is finally being talked about outside its usual bubble, and that changes everything. In past negotiations, players were asking for progress in a league that felt stuck. The moral case was simple. Nothing is growing, so the system needs to change. But now the system is actively changing. And that's what complicates this. The offers on the table aren't symbolic. They aren't vague promises about the future. They aren't "we'll revisit this in a few years." They're concrete numbers. Contracts that represent the single biggest pay increase any professional women's basketball league has ever offered its players. That reality flips the psychology of the fight, because it forces players to compare two very different things. On one side, collective ideals, respect, recognition, long-term positioning, correcting historical wrongs. On the other, immediate transformation, financial security, stability, and opportunity that may never come again. That's not a fair comparison. And that's why this moment feels heavier than every CBA battle before it. Because saying no doesn't just delay progress. It risks losing it. Careers in this league are short. Windows close fast. One injury can end everything. And asking players to sacrifice a season of earning during the most promising growth phase the league has ever seen is a gamble with consequences that can't be undone. This isn't just about squeezing more value out of owners. It's about whether the league can afford internal fracture right now. Momentum is fragile. Sponsors don't wait. Networks don't wait. Casual fans don't wait. They move on. And if this moment passes without resolution, it may not come back the same way. That's why the league's strategy isn't aggressive, it's patient. They're letting the weight of reality do the work. They're betting that when players truly sit alone with their finances, their futures, and their limited time, the abstract language of principle will start to feel distant. And that doesn't make anyone greedy. It makes them human. This isn't the kind of labor fight that ends with a dramatic victory speech. It's the kind that ends quietly, one decision at a time, until suddenly it's over. And by the time everyone realizes what's been lost or gained, the league will already be moving forward. That's why this negotiation doesn't feel like a battle. It feels like a test of patience, of unity, and of whether idealism can survive when reality finally shows up with a number attached to it. Every labor standoff eventually comes down to a single moment. Not a meeting, not a vote, not a public announcement, a decision made in private. That's the part people rarely see, and the part that decides everything. Because behind closed doors, away from union messaging and social media pressure, each player has to answer a question no one else can answer for them. What happens if this drags on longer than expected? What happens if the season gets delayed, or shortened, or never happens at all? Those aren't hypotheticals for players without financial buffers. They're real possibilities that sit in the back of their minds every night. At some point, the language of unity gives way to something more personal. Bills, rent, family, health, time. And that's when the abstract starts to crack. Because the first player who signs isn't making a political statement. She's making a survival decision. She's choosing certainty in a career defined by uncertainty. Stability in a profession where one injury can erase everything. And when that first signature happens, it doesn't happen loudly. There won't be a press release. There won't be a victory lap. There won't be a viral announcement. It'll happen quietly. A contract sent back. A phone call returned. A decision finalized. But the impact will be immediate. Because the moment one player breaks rank, everyone else has to reassess their own position. Not ideologically. Practically. No one wants to be the last person holding out while others lock in their futures. No one wants to be the example of loyalty that costs them a year of their career. And that's how unity erodes, not through betrayal, but through inevitability. The league understands this. They're not pushing players to fold. They're letting pressure do what pressure always does. Time doesn't strengthen collective resolve. It isolates individuals. And isolation changes behavior. Once the dam breaks, it doesn't matter how strong the messaging was before. Momentum flips instantly. The story stops being about principle and starts being about outcomes. And that's why this moment feels so final. Because once the first contract is signed, there's no rewinding the narrative. No resetting leverage. No reclaiming moral clarity. From that point on, the negotiation isn't about whether unity can hold. It's about how fast it collapses. And everyone involved knows it. They're just waiting to see who makes the first move. Breanna Stewart's resume is already secure. Multiple championships, individual awards, international success. On paper, there's nothing left for her to prove as a player. But legacies in sports are rarely decided by box scores. They're shaped by moments, especially the ones that test leadership when the stakes extend beyond the court. And this is one of those moments. For the first time in her career, Stewart isn't just being evaluated as an athlete. She's being judged as a power broker, a decision maker, someone whose influence reaches into the futures of hundreds of other players. That's a different standard, because leadership isn't measured by what you win when things go right. It's measured by who bears the cost when things go wrong. Right now, Stewart sits in a uniquely protected position, financially secure, endorsed, invested, insulated from the short-term fallout of delays or disruptions. Most players don't share that reality. So when she speaks, her words don't land evenly. To some, she represents courage, a player willing to challenge the system and push for long overdue change. To others, she represents distance, someone whose safety net makes risk easier to recommend than to live with. And that tension matters, because history doesn't just record what leaders fight for. It remembers who they were fighting for, and who is left exposed in the process. If this standoff ends with meaningful gains across the board, Stewart will be credited as someone who helped redefine the balance of power in women's basketball. Her involvement will be framed as visionary, even necessary. But if the outcome fractures careers, delays seasons, or leaves mid-tier players worse off than they started, the narrative will harden fast. Not around intent, around consequence. And that's the burden of leadership few athletes ever have to carry. Because once you step into influence, neutrality disappears. Every outcome attaches itself to your name, fairly or not. Stewart didn't just join this moment. She helped shape it. And that means her legacy will no longer be confined to banners and trophies. It will include boardrooms, negotiations, and decisions made away from cameras. This is the chapter that turns an all-time great into something else entirely. Either a pioneer who helped reshape the sport, or a symbol of how power, even when well-intentioned, can drift away from the people it's meant to serve. There's no stat line for that. No highlight reel. Just history, written after the dust settles, when everyone looks back and asks the same question. Who did this moment really help? From the outside, the league's silence looks almost strange. No emergency press conferences. No aggressive statements. No public sparring with the players' union. Just contracts, deadlines, and time. That quiet isn't accidental. It's strategy. The league understands something fundamental about labor disputes. The side that can afford to wait usually wins. And in this case, waiting costs the league money, but it costs players time. Time is the most expensive currency in professional sports. Careers are short. Bodies break down. Earning windows close fast. The league doesn't need to rush. The NBA has subsidized losses for decades. A delayed season is an accounting problem, not an existential one. For players, it's different. A delayed season isn't just postponed income, it's lost opportunity, lost visibility, lost momentum in a moment when the sport is finally breaking through. And the league is betting that players know this. That when messaging fades and pressure becomes personal, individual reality will override collective resolve. That's not cruelty. It's human behavior. Most players don't think in terms of 5-year strategies. They think in terms of next season, next contract, next injury. The league's approach forces players to confront those realities alone. Not in meetings, not on social media, but at home with spreadsheets, bills, and conversations with family. That's where decisions get made. And the longer this drags out, the more those private calculations matter. The league doesn't need everyone to fold. It doesn't even need most players to fold. It needs a crack. One decision that shifts momentum. One player who chooses certainty over principle. One signature that proves unity has limits. Once that happens, the pressure multiplies. Because suddenly, the risk isn't just financial, it's strategic. Players who wait too long risk being left behind, watching others secure contracts while they hold out for something that may never arrive. The league understands that fear. They're not exploiting it. They're acknowledging it. And that acknowledgement is what makes this strategy so effective. Because while the union speaks in collective language, the league speaks in individual consequences. And individual consequences are harder to ignore. This isn't a showdown designed to embarrass players or break the union publicly. It's designed to quietly reframe the negotiation from ideology to reality, from what we deserve to what we can't afford to lose. And once that shift happens, the outcome stops being dramatic. It becomes inevitable. No matter how this standoff ends, the WNBA won't simply return to normal. There's no reset button for moments like this. Because what's happening right now isn't just a negotiation. It's a recalibration of power, expectations, and trust that will echo long after contracts are signed and the season moves forward. If players eventually accept the deal, future negotiations will look very different. Owners will know exactly where collective resolve bends. They'll understand how long unity holds under pressure, and where individual realities start to outweigh shared principles. That knowledge doesn't disappear. It becomes leverage. The tone of future CBAs will be colder, more transactional, less driven by narrative, and more by precedent. The goodwill that once softened conversations will be replaced by spreadsheets and timelines, and players will feel that shift immediately. If, on the other hand, the union somehow holds firm and extracts further concessions, the internal structure of player leadership will face scrutiny. Conflicts of interest won't be brushed aside next time. Governance will be questioned. Roles will be defined more carefully. Because success doesn't erase risk, it exposes it. Either way, innocence is gone. This moment marks the end of the WNBA's transitional era, the phase where growth masked fragility and optimism papered over structural tension. From here forward, the league enters a new phase, one where growth brings pressure, where attention brings accountability, and where every decision is examined through a business lens. That's not a bad thing. It's just different. The league is no longer fighting for relevance. It has it. And relevance comes with expectations, from fans, from sponsors, from networks, and from players themselves. How this dispute resolves will signal what kind of league the WNBA intends to be moving forward. One driven by symbolic unity, or one governed by pragmatic negotiation. One that prioritizes collective messaging, or one that acknowledges individual reality. And perhaps most importantly, one that understands that success changes the rules. Because once a league proves it can grow, it can no longer afford chaos. Not now. Not with momentum on the line. Not with a generation of new fans watching closely. This isn't just about the next contract cycle. It's about whether the WNBA can manage success without tearing itself apart. And the answer to that question will define the league for the next decade. When all the noise fades, this story isn't really about contracts. It's about timing. The WNBA waited years for this moment, for growth, relevance, and real leverage in the broader sports conversation. And now that it's finally here, the league finds itself testing whether success makes unity stronger or more fragile. Because asking for more is one thing. Asking for more while momentum is peaking is something else entirely. This dispute has exposed a quiet tension that's been building for years. The gap between ideals and reality. Between leadership and lived experience. Between what sounds right in public and what feels risky in private. Every player involved believes in fairness. That's not in question. What is in question is how much uncertainty anyone should be asked to carry in a profession where time is unforgiving and careers are short. There's no universal answer to that. Some players will see this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reset the system and push for lasting change. Others will see it as a narrow window that could close without warning, a moment where securing stability matters more than symbolism. Neither perspective is wrong, but they don't coexist easily. And that's why this moment feels so tense. Because it forces players, fans, and leadership to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress doesn't always move in a straight line, and unity isn't tested when things are easy. It's tested when the cost becomes personal. At some point, this standoff will end. Contracts will be signed. Games will be played. The league will move forward. But the questions raised here won't disappear. They'll resurface in future negotiations, in leadership decisions, in how fans interpret the next conflict. And long after this moment passes, people will look back and ask whether this was the turning point that strengthened the league, or the one that revealed how fragile its balance really was. Because some moments don't just resolve themselves. They linger. And this is one of them. If you want real conversations about women's basketball, not headlines, not PR spin, but what's actually happening behind the scenes, this is exactly what we do here. Subscribe if you want deeper breakdowns, uncomfortable questions, and the stories shaping the future of the WNBA that most outlets won't touch. Because moments like this don't just pass. They define eras.